Welcome to the Skeptic's Guide to Investing with Steve Davenport and Clem Miller. Every 2 weeks, Steve and Clem bring you brief investment insights you may not find anywhere else. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Here are Steve and Clem.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Skeptic's Guide to Investing. I'm Clem Miller. I'm here with my co-host, Steve Davenport. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting event that happened during the last week, which was a global a global outage in the basically the entire IT framework of the world, hence global, that arose from the uploading of some faulty software. So let me explain what happened, and then we can talk about the implications and thinking about this from a practical and a philosophical basis as well. So cyber attacks have been an issue increasingly over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And as such, there has grown an industry, the cybersecurity industry, which provides various kinds of contract services to businesses to try to prevent cyber attacks or to protect machines and networks and so on from cyber intrusions. You might remember, I'm going all the way back decades, the Norton antivirus software and the Kaspersky Labs antivirus software. You recall all that? Well, those were the beginning efforts to deal with cyber intrusions, and that whole industry has evolved. And so you've got a number of companies that are out there, Crowdstrike, Fortinet, and others that are big providers of cybersecurity solutions of various kinds. They all have different niches. Some are focused on the individual endpoints, which are the machines that you and I have on our desks, either at home or at work. Some are network solutions providers. They're involved in trying to protect networks and the cloud inputs and so on and so forth. But you had this entire industry grow, and as such, you had companies like Microsoft and Apple and Amazon and others who began to rely on these outsourced cybersecurity suppliers to provide their services, their cybersecurity services. A few years ago, I think it was 2017 maybe, you had a pretty significant Russian cyber attack that affected a company called SolarWinds. And SolarWinds had a software called a business software called Orion, which was used by a number of information services companies and other kinds of companies. And so that cyber attack went in through, in effect, the back door of this Orion software and infected computer systems worldwide. So that was sort of the first thinking or first indication that you could have cyber attacks that came in through, in effect, the information supply chain. That is, a contractor would be infected, and then that virus would then spread to that contractor's customers. And so you had that with SolarWinds. Now you have, with this latest incident involving CrowdStrike, something that's even weirder. Didn't involve a cyber attack. No, it did not. But what it did involve was cyber attack. CrowdStrike created its own software called Falcon, and this was cybersecurity software, but it it accidentally put a problem, some errors. It accidentally released it with some errors included in it, and uploaded it. And these errors proliferated across all of CrowdStrike's customers and basically locked up machines, especially Microsoft machines. Not all Microsoft machines, but a lot of Microsoft machines were impacted. And for some reason,
500,000, I think.
yeah, for some reason or another, Microsoft, they just relied on CrowdStrike and just assumed that CrowdStrike was doing the right thing. And what actually happened was that Microsoft, they didn't check, right, what CrowdStrike was doing or offering them. You would think they would. They're a huge company with lots of programmers.
Well, that's what I kind of think that CrowdStrike might be taken out to the woodshed, and I'm not sure that Microsoft shouldn't be taken out as well. And I'm not sure you can blame it all on one upload and say, oh, well, they had this line of code that was bad. I didn't have any kind of verification as to bad code potentially, and therefore I am completely at the whim of whatever you give me. I'm not sure that's how the largest software company in the world should react.
No, absolutely not. And that is
But they're getting a free lunch here, aren't they?
Right. That is the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is that you don't have this redundant review. My son is involved in, you could say, software development in a particular industry, and very software intensive. And they do all sorts of code review before they release something into the wild, so to speak. And that should have been done in this case. There should have been some code review not just by CrowdStrike itself, but by its customers, especially Microsoft, and that would have prevented these issues.
Is there a step in that process for them to do that though? Like if suddenly CrowdStrike says, "Here's our new software," and they put it in play, that's in production. Microsoft can't suddenly say, "Okay, everything stop. We're going to evaluate the new code from CrowdStrike." I mean, do they get the code ahead of time and have the ability to evaluate it before it goes into production, or do they get it at the same time everybody else does?
I don't know. I think that's an excellent question. My guess about that is that CrowdStrike won't want to release its IP to its clients, and as a result, the clients have to basically trust their suppliers, their cybersecurity suppliers, and so, I mean, basically, the irony of this whole thing is that Microsoft and other companies are relying on cybersecurity suppliers to protect them against cyber attacks, and yet expose themselves to problems with these cybersecurity companies that result in the same damage as a cyber attack would. That's the whole irony to this whole thing. Which I think raises the philosophical question, Steve, quite apart from all the practical details about code and whatnot. It raises the philosophical question of whether our society and the economy is becoming too interconnected. And when you consider the fact, I mean, think about Target a few years ago. Target was the subject of a cyber attack that came in through the HVAC system. An HVAC supplier was infected, and that HVAC supplier came in through the HVAC supplier and infected Target and stole all sorts of financial information from Target. So, who would have thunk, right? And then you've got these Internet of Things. Everything is beginning to get connected to the internet. Appliances, You've got all sorts of things around that are now connected to the internet. I'm sure many things that we're not even aware of, right, are connected to the internet. And those things are potentially anything that's connected to the internet is potentially subject to having problems either through a cyber attack or through bad software uploads. So, that's a potential problem. And I'll make it even more scarier for you, Steve. So there's
Oh,
something
no.
called SCADA software. You ever heard of SCADA software?
No.
Supervisory control and data acquisition. Supervisory control and data acquisition. That's a fancy term for the fact that industrial facilities, railroads, transportation facilities, utilities, all can be remotely controlled through these remote control computer systems, where you can basically sit at a desk, in Hawaii, right, and run a utility in Georgia, and using this system. But if the SCADA system is infected, especially if it's something called remote execution software, somebody could come in, take over, just not even gum it up, but take over the entire operation of whatever it is you're trying to control from Hawaii, right? Whether it's a utility or a train or whatnot, you could run the trains off the tracks. There have been instances where utilities have started to put in too much chlorine, have have
What
basically.
about the train accidents in Ohio? I mean,
Yeah,
where those,
maybe.
I mean, I can't imagine a company would admit to being compromised. So they would just take there was a mistake and move on and not want to share that. I guess what's the obligation of these companies to shareholders to be completely honest and straightforward?
Well, that is exactly what the next thing I was going to say, Steve, and I'm glad you raised it, because recently the SEC said that in their risk factor disclosures in their 10Ks, companies now are now required to talk about cybersecurity. And on top of that, they're supposed to make interim filings within a certain number of days after a cyber incident has occurred. Now, I don't know whether that includes incidents involving the cybersecurity providers, but it does involve having to notify about significant cyber intrusions. And so there is now a requirement, and I know that companies are starting to report. I want to say it's within 4 business days of
Yeah, I saw something about that, but I again, I can't imagine that their filings are going to provide any kind of detail, because if they did, then they open themselves up to lawsuits for negligence
right.
and
And
poor performance.
yeah, at 4 days after, how much are you going to know, really?
We'll be right back.
We hope you're enjoying our episodes. If you are, then we'd greatly appreciate your liking, following, and sharing. Help us help others. Now let's get back to the discussion.
Yeah, I think these companies know a lot on day one, and they don't, necessarily share it as well as they should. So, as a
So there
business
is.
opportunity, I look at this and say, who's the competitor who's going to benefit the most from this? I understand that Sentinel is a smaller competitor who, well, look, when I was working for State Street, there was a lot of talk about how they had, a backup outside of this grid, so they could move and take location if something compromised the grid. They could relocate and be able to operate distinctly in several locations in several regions of the world. And one of the things they always said was, well, we try to have multiple vendors so that we can, not be tied to one if something goes down or goes wrong.
Yeah.
But then during COVID and everybody trying to cut costs and improve, streamline, a lot of people said, we've got to isolate and become more central on one because we just can't spend the money on this. And I look at this and say, there really shouldn't be one cyber vendor.
Yeah.
If you've got what I would say critical operations, which would be utilities, trains, transportation, those should have a different cybersecurity software than the average person who's sitting at a desk at home.
Yeah.
I don't imagine that there is the same areas of expertise. So I guess I would say I think that we may have gone too far in the general interconnectedness of things. I think we have to start to say, from a national security interest, I think the military needs to be on its own network and have its own equipment.
So the military generally is on its own equipment already. So generally speaking,
But if I wanted to move things on the trains, I've got to imagine that in the military, I got to move 16 Sherman tanks over to Mexico.
Well, yeah, you're reliant on the normal train system.
There is an interconnectedness of which we cannot deny.
Correct.
And so what I'm trying to do is say, where do we draw the lines? The lines have to be drawn.
Yeah.
You're in free business and you are are airlines really a business, or are airlines really a more regulated form of a utility? I think airlines and finance are both on the bottom, are on that edge that you could easily see them because of their absolutely horrible performance in being able to judge and take care of consumers on a regular basis.
Right.
I think that finance is going in that same direction. And I think that when we look at this, I'm not saying we should socialize everything, but there are certain parts of this that I'm not sure remain in the truly free business area because they just don't perform on a regular basis. They have regular problems with the ideas of how to operate safely for the consumers to give them a consistent product. And I think that, both finance and transportation kind of go into that bucket. Yeah. And then you start to say, because they have a national interest, we need to do something to make sure their security is greater than, military is the top of the pyramid. The next two are utilities and maybe energy infrastructure. And then maybe we go to transportation and educational institutions.
So on cybersecurity, if I think, you've got sectors that are highly regulated in this country and in many countries. If they're not highly regulated, then they're actually owned by and managed by governments themselves.
Sure.
Cybersecurity is an area which is lightly regulated, if at all. Okay. What happens with cybersecurity is that the resources that governments provide in terms of cybersecurity are aimed at helping rather than regulating. And perhaps that needs to change. Now, what I mean by helping rather than regulating, intending to help, is you've got this agency within Homeland Security called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, which I assume is pronounced CISA or CISA. And CISA is an agency that provides guidance to industry, runs some interagency forums, some intercompany forums, provides antitrust protection against companies or for companies that work within industries that work together on cybersecurity problems. And then you've got NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, which provides technical standards for cybersecurity. So those are ways of trying to help industry protect itself.
Recently, they put the National Center for Military Cyber in Macon, Georgia.
Yeah,
and I think it's important that we have some type of recognition that, hey, the military's cyber needs are different than the commercial needs. And I guess that's what I'm saying, is that it almost feels like we tried to take a commercial application, apply it to airlines and trains, and this example of how interconnected and potentially non-fail-safe they became. Really, I mean, let's talk about Delta.
Yeah. I was just
Delta,
thinking that.
for some reason, I mean, I don't really know if this is true, but it feels to me like these companies are still running applications on mainframes that they've just had forever. And when something happens like this, nobody knows how to go in and get the code right. And I look at Delta and I say, how is a stock, if United and American are back in the air and scheduling okay in one day, and you're in day 3 or 4 and you're still not sure? I mean, I got to imagine that there's been a failure, Houston. We need to rectify this. I'm surprised at how Delta can be how do the analysts look at this? Because to me, is if an analyst looks at a company and says, well, their weakness is that anytime there's a cyber problem or tech problem, it takes them 2 or 3 times longer. Well, I mean, that means there's something inherent in their infrastructure that's not being well handled. Therefore, they're not spending enough resources, or they're not spending the resources well. They should be marked for that.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the market can figure all these things out, but I don't know who will. But somebody needs to, right? I mean, do you want to invest in a company that continuously has more problems with their technology?
No.
At this point, I don't know. Do you own any of the airlines?
No.
All right. Do you own any transportation?
No.
Okay. So, I mean, economic activity in the country are pretty closely linked. And these companies help keep the trains moving, the boats coming into port, and the goods being moved. And I look at this and say, something needs to change in order to make these people more accountable. Because and then I said Delta is now, refunding the payments for these flights that all got delayed. And now people are saying, well, what about my hotel? And what about my lost, how do we measure lost productivity? For 2 or 3 days, people were sitting in, airlines and sitting in airports. That's something that has to be, I think if you make the penalties large enough, people will economically be incented to come up with better solutions, won't they?
Absolutely.
I mean, it feels like we've got.
But it has to be regulated better.
Okay.
The airlines have to be regulated better on a financial, to deal with cybersecurity. There has to be greater regulation of cybersecurity in general, not just airlines, but across the board. There needs to be stronger cybersecurity regulation with violations punished. And you just don't have that yet in the US. You've got, agencies that are supposed to help, that do help, but there's no, it's all like carrot and no stick in the US as far as cybersecurity is concerned.
Okay. I mean, I saw some estimates of 4 billion being the impact, and their CrowdStrike could take most of that hit. And their whole revenue for a year is 4 billion. So I'm not sure how they come out of this, whether some of the blame or some of the responsibility goes to others. But I think it's interesting when we talked to the CEO, or when we saw the CEO's response, his comment was, we add to our goodwill drop by drop. And then when we have an event like this, the goodwill goes away in buckets. I think that this is an example of how we need to be a little more as analysts for companies, we need to look at them in terms of how do they perform in these crisis type situations, just as how you look at how they perform in day to day, quarter to quarter. What are their earnings? What are the revenue? You know, we look very closely at some things, but some things we just kind of give up to that idea that we can't quantify it.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what we say. If we can't quantify it, then it doesn't exist, or you know, we don't need to.
Come on, it's not that it doesn't exist.
We don't
that's
need
my
to.
point.
We don't need to consider
we're
it.
just not like, even if we did a 500, you know, even if we did 200 million, put some number, against goodwill. Isn't this where goodwill comes in? Bad will also comes in, doesn't it, Clem?
Yeah, and this is what diversification is for in a portfolio, in part as well.
Wow.
To diversify.
Your diversification is to not own any of them, right? That's not. You don't agree in diversification.
Diversification, right?
So
no, I mean, I don't like so much to be in. I don't like so much to be in certain heavily regulated industries, but I get there from sort of the back end by looking at results. And
I think we're talking about whether to be in these cyber stocks.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, you know, it's not a free lunch when they say, oh, look at these multiples, look at their growth rate, look at this, you know, and I'm like, okay, but the more they grow, the more they open up the possibility that they're impacting another industry in another place where there could be liability, right?
Right. And they could be growing too fast and not paying attention.
Right. So I think we want to wrap up this CrowdStrike, and I guess I would say, from my point of view, it's not always as it appears. I think that there's some responsibility here for Microsoft, and I think there's probably responsibility for the companies and the industries that didn't do a good job of diversifying their cyber needs, such that they have some fail-safes and some things in place that would prevent them from exposing themselves to this much liability. I don't want them to have another 3 days like this. I think the stock should be even lower. So I think there's a question when you get into these is, okay, I understand when everybody's safe and you collected the regular revenue of a subscription model, but I also understand when there's a wide open event that could impact many industries, and you're ultimately going to be held responsible. I almost think that the legal areas should be that there's responsibility. The minute you take someone else's code and put it to work, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, you know, they're still responsible. So if your codes don't work with their code, then therefore I think you still, you know, would take on a little bit of that responsibility. How do you view this, and what's your perspective, Clem?
I think a lot of work has to be done in companies and at the government level, both in the United States and around the world, to really amp up cybersecurity, and not just providing resources, but in terms of having, you know, strong regulations that would impose severe penalties and reputational damage, right, on companies that, you know, aren't living up to code, so to speak, right?
Right.
I think that's that has to be the answer, and it can't just be, oh, it's a black swan, let's forget about it, right? We can't measure it because it's not a black swan. You know, the timing might be a black swan, but the issue is not a black swan. We know the issue's out there, and we know the issue is one that's going to be with us, and with us increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, this is a shoot yourself in the foot type of event. Like you said, there wasn't some clever, you know, cyber criminal who outsmarted all the people at CrowdStrike. This was self-inflicted, and therefore I'd say that if it was within their control, and it was in Microsoft's control to make sure something should have been done differently. These people shouldn't have suffered this kind of 3-day barrage of inconsistency from technology, because I just thought we were going into the AI age where things were going to be done better. And this just makes me question whether that AI is going to ultimately contain more bugs than less bugs. So I'm a little skeptical, Clem. I don't know how you are, but you seem to have found the solution, which is to not invest in this area. So I think that you've given us your skepticism by showing us where you put your money.
Right.
I think thank you everybody for listening, and we appreciate
Thank you.
And we hope that you enjoy this. And if you do, please download, like, and share with others. Thanks, and have a great day.
The views shared on this podcast represent the personal investment views of the hosts. They are for educational purposes and not meant to be taken as investment advice. Listeners should consult their own investment, legal, and tax advisors. Past performance of any investments is not a guarantee for future return.